Today we're going to talk about some of the implications of thermochemistry with our society itself. Particularly, we want to talk about the types of decisions we need to make around fuel usage. The reason we're doing this is because we want to be able to make informed decisions about our economy, and our success criteria is being able to describe the issues relating energy to the environment, waste extraction, and renewability. So, one of the big driving factors of modern society is ensuring we have enough energy that we can continue our industry and economy. There's three questions that are useful to think about because all energy that we create is dependent on a thermochemical reaction somewhere. So, we want to be able to think about if a fuel produces harmful byproducts, if extracting a fuel can cause damage, and if removal of a particular energy resource depletes it permanently, if something's renewable or non-renewable. So the big one, you probably all know this, with waste products is, of course, greenhouse gases. Rising CO2 levels in our atmosphere are dangerous, and we know that we people are causing the rising CO2 levels because we can actually match it through isotope studies. Um, Plants take in certain isotopes of carbon dioxide differently than they exist in our atmosphere naturally. So as the chain, we can see that the isotope ratio is changing, and is changing because we're releasing those isotopes that are in greater concentrations trapped in fossil fuels that originally were plants. We also have to consider carbon monoxide production. If fuels aren't properly combusted, they will produce carbon monoxide instead of carbon dioxide, and that, of course, is extremely toxic and can be very dangerous, especially if it can be trapped in small areas. We also have to consider the release of nitrogen and sulfur oxides, which directly contribute and convert into nitric, nitrous, sulfuric, and sulfurous acid, which causes harmful acid rains. Acid rain, both being bad for the environment in that it makes soil acidify, making it hostile to particular species of plants, also bad for the materials we commonly use, particularly iron and marble and limestone, which are very common construction materials. So if you think that the whole let's not destroy the planet through environmentalism is just based off of trying to save the environment, it's actually not. There's a lot of self-interest that goes into that as well. And a common proposal for getting off fossil fuels is switching over to nuclear waste or to nuclear reactors. And of course, we run the risk of producing nuclear waste there. There's not necessarily a good answer or a bad answer here. We have to think about the answer that we pick and its consequences. Just because nuclear fuel produces nuclear waste doesn't mean it's impossibly bad or we should not use it. But we have to consider things like storage and long-term damage that could be caused by those nuclear wastes. Another thing we have to consider is extraction. Traditional fuels have a high impact through mining and potentially can have an impact during transportation if they spill, which we have seen more and more recently. Oil and gas spills causing extreme environmental damage. Likewise, nuclear waste also has extraction issues, but so do hydroelectric and tidal power sources. Again, there's no good or bad power source. There's consequences to how we use power sources, and we need to consider carefully which consequences are we willing to live with and which consequences can we mitigate. Hydroelectric and tidal power sources alter landscapes, and they can damage local ecosystems and communities, causing them to change the way, that they interact with their environment, potentially even removing their home territory. So we must consider that carefully. Can mining be bad? Absolutely. It is often. Can hydroelectric also be bad? Yes. Can we use those in targeted areas to minimize their impact? Also, yes. We need to think about when and why we deploy particular strategies. Same thing goes with renewability. Um, Both natural gases, nuclear fuels, and oil are all limited non renewable resources. So we have to think carefully about when and how we use them. One of the big things, of course, with organic compounds like natural gases and oils is that we have to consider that we don't just use these for fuel, we also use them for plastics. And plastics are everywhere these days. Uh, I actually think it would be much easier to find an alternate fuel source than an alternate durable plastic. If we run out of oil and gas, or oil and gas become prohibitively expensive, how does that impact the rest of our world when we are dependent on plastics? Um, of course, we also have to consider the suitability of different renewable resources because they can be temperamental. Solar power is effective in many different places, but we do have to consider day-night cycles and weather cycles. The advantage with solar power is that you can store energy into a battery, but if you have to potentially have that battery last you through very long periods, there is a risk of it running out. So it's not so much that day-night cycles and weather mean that solar power is unusable, but it does mean that there are certain places where it is more or less viable. Same thing with wind power, as well as the impact that wind turbines could have on people wanting to live in a particular place. We have to think carefully about when and how we deploy them. You need areas with constant wind. Usually you want them to be far away from people. So we'll see wind turbines in the relatively uninhabited areas of southern Alberta, where having gone to U of L for my education degree, I can tell you the wind rips through there constantly. It is a great source of electricity down there. But not so much viable in Calgary. Definitely not viable in the Rocky Mountains. Same thing with geothermal, even. Geothermal is super usable in BC because they sit close to a tectonic plate. Calgary, not so much. So it's not a stable source of energy. And it's important to think about these things because our technology that we use shapes life, it shapes our society. Uh, Things will change depending on the technologies being used, so we need to think about how that changes us. We are not the only thing that act on technology and chemical reactions, they also act upon us. So we need to think what, why, how are the decisions that we make today going to alter the economy and the environment in the future? We must be willing to evaluate the sources of our fuels because their benefits can improve our lives. But if we aren't realistic about their shortcomings, those shortcomings will come back and bite us.